Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, how do you turn a crime into a calling? That's the question at the heart of this episode, and it's a little bit different from the usual type of interview that I do. My guest is Tom Hardin, also known as Tipper X. Now, if you haven't already heard Tom's original appearance on the show, he was one of the very first episodes I did, where he tells the story of how he became an FBI informant in one of the largest insider trading investigations in US history, then I'd highly recommend listening to that first. There's a link in the show notes. It'll give you a solid sense of who Tom is and what he went through. Now, we do touch on parts of that story in the conversation, but it's not the focus of our discussion, because this time we're talking about what's happened since. Now, Tom and I first met years ago when he came in to speak at UBS while I was working there, and since then we've stayed in close contact. Whenever I'm in the US or he's in Europe, we make a point of trying to catch up. I've come to know him really well. He's thoughtful, insightful, and incredibly self-aware about his past. He's also generous, funny, and kind, and he's someone I've learned a lot from, both professionally and personally. We often talk about what it's like to be a speaker, how we work with clients, how we keep things meaningful, and over time we've recommended each other to people we think would benefit from our perspectives. And one of those occasions led to this episode. I was speaking to someone who runs a conference I'd previously spoken at and got in touch to suggest that Tom might be a great fit. Their response was incredibly positive about Tom, but he said he was kind of done with redemption tours. And that really struck me because I think Tom isn't just another redemption story. I think he's doing something pretty unique, and I wanted to unpack that. So firstly, a thank you to that person, you know who you are, for sparking this conversation, because it prompted me to go back to Tom and say, why don't we have a public conversation about what we often discuss privately? What does it mean to spend your working life talking about the worst thing you've ever done? How do you keep it authentic and relevant after over 600 talks? And that's before we even count podcasts. And what are the ethics of being paid to share a crime? Tom does all of this with honesty, humility, and insight, and I think that makes him a truly rare voice in this space. He's not trying to sugarcoat anything. He's not performing regret. He's offering something useful. Now, Tom has a book coming out early next year called Wired on Wall Street. Pre-orders available now, and he will be back on the show to talk about that closer to publication. But if you want to get your order in now, there's a link in the show notes. But for now, here's my discussion with Tom Hardin on going behind the scenes of Tipper X, the business. We're talking about turning a crime into a calling. Tom, welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast.
It's great to be back with you here, Christian.
It's such a pleasure to have you. I'm really intrigued by this episode because you've been on the show before. We've talked about your story, and there's a link to that in the show notes. But one of the things that we talked about recently when I met up in New York, and I should add as an aside that we had an adventure reliving your past steps because we were in a part of town that you sort of said, oh, I know this part of town quite well. And I just said, is this where the FBI first contacted you? And you said yes. And you were kind enough to retrace some of the steps that you hadn't done for some time. So I want to say, firstly, thank you for that experience. The second thing was one of the things that we started to talk about was not so much your story, but your business model and the sorts of things that you do. And obviously you're in a very unique position. And I guess one of the things that is probably just worth revisiting is how you got into this, because when you were going through your period of reflecting on what you'd done, you hadn't planned this speaking career.
So yeah, there was no really any idea I ever had to actually talk about my experience. People that can listen to are familiar with my story, young Wall Street analyst in the hedge fund industry, insider trading, cooperated with the FBI, sentenced. But it wasn't about, oh, here's a big commercial opportunity to go share that story. For me, the FBI invited me to speak about my case years after I was sentenced. And I looked at it as something that was more about, service. They felt that because I was very young that I could sort of look back, look at the rationalizations, the pressures, the isolation I was under. And maybe that story could just help FBI agents when they build new cases. So that's the way I looked at it, as just being, of service. And so from there, my second career came out of that, but it wasn't overnight. I was still dealing with a lot of shame and guilt. And guilt is, I did a bad thing, but I might be an okay person that got in a situation that was overwhelming and made poor choices. And the shame was I'm a terrible person who did the bad thing. And that's not helpful for anybody. So I had to work through that mentally before I could really talk about the story. And once I got comfortable in seeing it might be of service, I just emailed universities, public libraries in my state of New Jersey to see if they would have me just come share the story and see if it might be of service to students on the young side, and also public libraries. The audience is sometimes, in their twilight years, and see if it actually could have an impact. So I did that for probably 6 months. Maybe there was one or two paid engagements. I don't think there was actually any. And then finally started getting invited to conferences from people that saw me at universities. And then companies actually said, well, what do you charge for this? And I was, again, never, it just felt like the right thing to do, of being of service, and then maybe it would lead to something. But I would caution to say that I, saw some big commercial opportunity from this, in the beginning.
And of course, it's worth just reflecting on the fact that given your experiences, a lot of things are out of bounds to you, right? So you can't work in financial services, for example. And so as you look at what you're going to be spending your time doing, there's this whole question about what is my purpose here, and how do I want to spend the rest of my life, and how can I build on what's there?
That's right. And I think with this, and you can either own your story or somebody else can. So as I started speaking, getting my reps and talking to the octogenarians at the public library, I saw a path to owning the story. And that was important to me because I figured, what else could I do with my life at this point? I would get emails, and I get them more now, from reputation management firms that would find my indictment on the internet. And I still get these now. They're AI generated emails. Mr. Thomas Hardin, we found your criminal indictment on the internet, for a certain fee, we'll clean this for you, as if, reputation can just be cleaned and managed. And then I send them my website now and say, here's a whole landing page for bad stuff. So it was important to own it, lean into it, look at why the decisions were made, why I crossed that line, and then also look at me not so much being the hero of my story, but me being the cautionary tale, and then somebody in the audience actually being the hero if they go back, take something from it, and can make a better decision when there's those pressures or those isolation factors.
And so the FBI invitation is coming, and then you decide to create this kind of, I guess, sort of just to test the waters a bit and partly see what it feels like for you to do it, partly, I guess, to see if the audience is there. I'm really fascinated by the move into the corporate piece, where because one of the things, and how we met was you presented at UBS, and I remember conversations, and I would imagine that lots of other people have these conversations of a presumption that there's something wrong with getting, why are we bringing a convicted felon in? Why are we paying someone to do this? All those sorts of questions. Is that something you've come across?
Absolutely. And I think audiences actually should be skeptical with people with my past. The skepticism when I started, and it still keeps me honest. So when I started walking into these rooms, as when we met years ago at the bank, senior leaders or the young professionals when I was there, they've only seen the headlines. And I know some were thinking, and as you mentioned, why should we listen to this guy? So what I've seen works, and what I still do, is I address it up front, what I did, how I cooperated with the FBI, and the consequences. So there's no sugarcoating, there's no victim framing. And once you name, at least in my experience, the elephant in the room, people can actually hear the message. So I also pivot quickly from my story to the audience's environment. So how the same pressures and rationalizations appear in their world. So that shift is where I've seen the skepticism turns into engagement. And then I'm also not, stuck telling war stories from 2008. I constantly update my content with, the fresh research, the enforcement cases, and the lessons from other industries, so that I'm a resource and not just a curiosity. And one final point here, I think, is I try to model vulnerability. If somebody challenges me, I don't dodge it, and I admit what I don't know. And once the audience can sense authenticity, and when I lean into their skepticism rather than fight it, many of these audiences start with their arms crossed. They actually end up leaning forward, and it may not be because they like me, but because they've been given something they can use.
And so when we look at the ways that you could approach this. One of the things is you glamorize the story and it becomes a storytelling. I guess there's a sort of looking for a kind of apology tour that's very, very scripted. And you deliberately haven't chosen to do that. As you say, you've been very, very authentic. That's a lot harder to do, right? It would be much easier
Yes.
just to come along and go, let me tell you my story, and to kind of almost use that as an attempt to redeem oneself. And you've deliberately chosen not to do that.
Yeah, I think a real redemption story, it certainly doesn't sanitize the ugly parts or cast the speaker, as I said, as the hero. It just begins with full ownership, not just I made a bad decision, but here's what I did, who it harmed, and why it matters. That's very uncomfortable, which is why I think some in this space will stop at just a polished narrative of personal growth. And so the second marker is whether the audience leaves with something usable. If all you do is retell your story with dramatic pauses, it's entertainment and not education. I went to a speaker camp last summer and I had 3 minutes on stage to just tell my story to get coaching. And the speaking coach is a very well-known speaker, $40,000 fee. He tore me apart. He's like, where's the dramatic pauses? You want the audience to have a standing ovation for you. And I don't want anything like that. I don't want a standing ovation. I think a meaningful redemption story gives people a lens to examine their own blind spots and incentives. So in my talks, I break my experiences into those forces that anybody can recognize in any industry. And that humility also matters. So, if a speaker is still centering themselves as the protagonist who overcame adversity rather than as a guide handing over hard-won insight, it's probably closer to an apology tour than a true act of service.
One of the things that you've alluded to there is the idea of updating the content. So again, it'd be very easy to just kind of go, the story is it, right? And I'll just tell the story over time. So a little bit, I guess, as the analogy would be people that climb mountains or kind of cross oceans in interesting ways, where they kind of stop there and it's just rolling out the same thing. You've made a conscious effort to, you can't update the story. And it's a key part that I think you don't update. It's not like kind of, oh, if I tell it this way, it'll sound a bit better. It's very much, the updating piece is very much, from what I've seen, around saying, what other lessons can we learn? And as you get insights from people, so it's the reflective part that changes. So the story remains constant because that has to remain constant. But then you're looking at updating the so what for people, because it's an interesting story, but it needs to deliver something. And that's the bit that you spend a lot of time looking at.
Yeah, and I'm very proud to say that I'm not, I have a Rolodex of clients now that invite me back every year. So obviously it can't be the exact same, 27 slides. Are they say any other new crimes, Tom? No, nothing to report, thank God. So, but I do treat my story as a doorway and not a destination. So it certainly grabs attention, but that's only the starting point. And every quarter I review the new behavioral ethics research, the fresh case studies, and that audience feedback you mentioned is also important. And what I try to do in my slide deck is I ask myself, if my name or Tipper X wasn't on this slide, would it still be valuable? And if not, I'll rewrite the slide. And I also mine all the Q&A for ideas from my events. Some of my best content, like my framework on isolated decision-making, it actually came directly from somebody challenging me in a session. And that feedback loop keeps me, I think, from drifting into autopilot. And I'm also open about bad decisions I've made since my case, because this decision-making, ethical decision-making, is a lifelong muscle. A few years after my case was over, I wasn't magically transformed. I actually, before I started speaking, I was applying for a volunteer board position in my town, and I filled out the background form. And one of the questions it asked, had I ever been involved in a federal investigation? And I hate to say it, but at the time, I rationalized that the case was behind me because it was technically over, and I checked no. But when I was driving home, I had that pit in my stomach grow. I realized I just repeated, sort of in a miniature way, the same pattern that brought me down. And I emailed the director that night, corrected my answer, apologized. And obviously that wasn't a crime, but it just reminded me that how vigilance isn't automatic. It's you have to keep choosing it. And even during COVID, when my business was slower, I partnered with a training vendor without proper vetting, and they oversold and underdelivered, and the client had a bad experience. And it wasn't criminal again, but it was sloppy, and it reflected on me. And I had to apologize, unwind the deal, and build a stricter vetting process. So that was just a humbling reminder that your reputation is only as strong as who you align yourself with. And it just helps me keep my talks rooted in real value and not just nostalgia.
And I think that positioning thing is really, really important. And I'm intrigued, how do you go about putting it out there? Because as you say, that sets the tone for what you are. And I'm intrigued how you think about that. I mean, how do you describe what you do?
The way I describe it is I share a cautionary tale, and then hopefully there's some lessons in there that people will write down, and take from that and apply it to their own work. So some of my favorite engagements was, it doesn't happen on the stage, but I'll get an email later from a junior professional, maybe a few weeks later, that I made them pause and think about a step that they were taking, a decision, or there was a meeting at one of my past clients a few weeks later where they brought up one of my frameworks and it actually helped them tilt away from gray areas. So I measure the impact, I guess, beyond the stage, because you want to have an impact, beyond the hour of the keynote. And so that's how I measure it. One trap, I think, in this space of reformed felon speakers is that a gripping story can just stand on its own for entertainment. So people love the rise and the fall narrative. You can get applause without teaching anything. And from the start, I've tried to resist that. So, the story, obviously my story grabs the attention, but my job is to hand people something they can use Monday morning. And, today when people snap photos of my slides, it's not of me wearing a wire at a swimming pool. That's a great story if people want to listen for that. But it's of my slides of isolated decision-making, or the accountability avoidance cycle, or the rationalization loop diagrams. And it's not just those headlines about my arrest. And that's intentional. If I've done my job as a storyteller, it's not just my story fades and the lessons stick. And because people learn differently, I leave behind, one pagers and checklists. So they leave with a tool and not just some dramatic memory of a crazy story.
One of the other features of the story, and again, as you say, people can listen to that in the previous episode, is you talking about you going to see a priest, right? Catholic confessional
Right.
was the way of handling the fact the FBI have just come across you. But there's a dynamic you've talked to me about before, which is people kind of using you in a similar way. And so subtle conversations after the event, I guess, in the sort of the socializing bit afterwards. And that strikes me that you wouldn't be able to have those conversations if you were just rolling out the story, because there wouldn't be that level of trust there to a certain extent. And so I guess that's another piece of feedback, really, is that engagement. People are prepared to talk to you about things other than your story.
That's right. And I often need, I think it's about modeling the vulnerability and retelling my story, and then people in the audience see themselves in my story at some step. Maybe I walk in the room and the arms are crossed and they're skeptical, but at some point they lean into it. And afterwards, usually at the bigger conferences, people will line up with their own confessions. I mean, I've heard about affairs people were having, and lines that they crossed maybe back in the 1990s, people that were older than me, that were one gentleman talked about himself spoofing trades his whole career in the 1990s and never getting caught. And I always tell them, don't worry, I'm not wearing a wire anymore. What's the ease? But also people see the vulnerability and come up and talk about their own past transgressions. And that's just, then the audience again is seeing it in themselves and not just hearing some crazy story that could be a movie. So that's, what I've seen over the years.
And you talked a little bit about your experience of somebody, for want of a better phrase, mis-selling what you're about. And this is going to sound slightly strange to some people, but I guess you have a reputation to protect. And particularly given your aim, you want to set out to do good, right? And not just kind of go there and do storytelling, but actually for that to deliver something. How do you go about protecting that reputation? And I'm really struck by these reputation protection people that sort of go, guess what they've said about you out there? You need to. So but there is an interesting thing here. You do have to think about your reputation. And so there's a fascinating sort of, feels like a little bit of a conundrum there. But how do you manage that reputation? And how do you think about where to appear, who to partner with, all those kinds of things?
Yeah. And I learned the hard way, back when I was younger, that your reputation is only as strong as who you align yourself with. And that's still true. So early on, before the COVID period, when I started speaking, I would just say yes to almost everything, really out of gratitude. And most of it was fine. But again, partnering with that training vendor a few years ago without the proper vetting, that kind of permanently changed how I approach partnerships. So Now what I'll do is I'll screen every opportunity through a few lenses, the mission, the audience, and kind of the ethics of the organizer. So if an event is mostly entertainment or true crime spectacle, I'm out at this point, 9 years into sharing my story. If it's generally about culture or compliance or leadership, then I'm in. And I ask who else is on the program, how my message will be framed, and I do informal reference checks with others who've worked with them. So it definitely takes more time, but sometimes it means walking away from easy money. But that's the price of protecting your reputation. When you're known for a cautionary tale, people project their own narratives onto you. And I think the only way to stay credible is to be deliberate about who you stand next to.
I guess if you're going to be talking about making good decisions, you're only as good as the good decisions you're making recently. And so one bad choice of platform or misselling is problematic, right? Because it goes against that.
That's right. That's right. You're only as good as your decisions. Yeah, that's correct.
In terms of, I mean, there are, other people, I hesitate to say in this space, because I'm not sure how I would define the space, but there are other people out there telling stories. I would imagine that there are opportunities to collaborate or to do things. How do you make those sorts of decisions? That's a similar, because I guess it's one thing looking at agencies and saying, I don't want to, or stages don't want to appear on that. But in terms of sort of partnerships with other people, I guess similar process to what you've talked about before, but you just have to, I guess, reflect a lot more, because it might sit nicely alongside your story, but if they're not approaching this in a similar way, you could be undermined by association.
That's right. And I look at, and it's be hard to figure out exactly how this person, got into the space of sharing their story and having that as their, source of income. Do they approach it as a service again for the audience, or are they just trying to be the hero of their own story? And it's become a more crowded space. But I think audiences and organizers are becoming more discerning. People can tell the difference between a polished apology tour and someone who's bringing real behavioral insight. So I think over time we'll see a shakeout where the speakers who actually do the hard work, they invest in the substance, the research, and the relevance will stay around. And the ones who just rely on shock value will fade out. Professionalism and substance will win, I think, over spectacle. And I'm looking at, and I think we'll see more collaboration, not just with people, with similar pasts like myself, but with people with this lived experience like me, and also people with, academic or regulatory expertise, joint presentations, workshops. And I think that's healthy, because it's going to move the conversation from one person like me's story to a more broader dialogue about culture and risk. And my hope is that this field matures into something where lived experience is a credential, but it's not the whole thing, and where you're hired not because of, my past, but because of the quality of the insight that I can deliver today.
And it's interesting, isn't it, really? Because, what you talk about is humans can make mistakes, and anyone can find themselves in making bad decisions. So it's not as if the roster of people that could be doing what you do is suddenly going to stop, right? Sadly, there will be a constant supply of them. Hopefully not people that have listened to your presentation, but
Right.
in other instances, there'll be this constant. And I guess part of the reason that you're doing what you're doing is that at some point, it becomes the dim and distant past, right? There will be people with bigger stories. And of course, the fascinating thing about yours is the numbers are not that big, right? So if we looked at it and sort of went, there'll be people, if you were leading with a headline number of the size of whatever, right, you're not really up there relative to some of the other people. And so I guess one of the things that to maintain the freshness and the relevance, it's not leaning on the story of what happened back at a time when actually many of your audiences weren't even alive. So I guess over time, part of that refreshing purpose is the story is the background to selling these things. But you have to kind of do that. Otherwise, there'll just be other people with more stories, bigger shock value, I guess.
Yeah, and I think with more people entering this space, um, I don't know if there has to be a licensing board, but I think just basic due diligence on speakers would go a long way. As you said, right now, anybody with a colorful past, with a bigger transgression, they can print a business card and pitch themselves as a keynote speaker. So and I understand people have to rebuild their lives, and this is an opportunity, but that's risky for audiences and for the credibility, I guess, you could call it my field. I think at a minimum, organizers should ask, has this person made restitution? Do they show genuine remorse? Are they offering, going back to this, insights relevant to your team or your audience, or just telling war stories? So, and have credible peers actually recommended them. Those simple checks an event planner can do would filter out a lot of the exploitation that's out there and probably still coming in the next couple of years. And it's also on people like me in this space to set the tone. I'm very careful about who I recommend and share a stage with. I'm part of a group in the US of people who have been through the white collar criminal justice system. And my biggest opportunity to help people in this group is to actually, if they want to be a speaker like me, to train them on how to do that. So my door is always open to have a conversation. And one thing I've seen is when people call their past transgressions mistakes, they haven't really owned it. It's always bad decisions. So that's one thing that people need to work on. And if somebody with a background like mine is still centering themselves as the hero again, or hasn't done the hard work of making amends, I want to endorse them. So that's partly self-protection on my part, but it's also about protecting the audience. And the more that we can model humility and transparency, the higher we're going to raise the standard without needing kind of any formal regulation about people in my space.
Looking forward, you've pointed a path to refreshing your content, to thinking, I guess, learning yourself about the science. So almost taking your experiences and looking behind it and trying to understand the psychology and the dynamics that play out, and looking for other examples of where this happens to make it more relatable to people. Obviously, you can continue doing that. How does the sort of path look? Any other things that you want to do beyond that?
Yeah, no, I love, speaking to new audiences, making people think, seeing people take pictures of not just, again, my headlines, but the takeaways. And the way that this has evolved for me is last year or a year and a half ago, there was a Fortune 100 company that had me speak at a leadership event. And then they actually invited me for an advisory engagement after one of my talks. And I thought, what do I advise about? But they wanted to actually make my isolated decision-making framework and my rationalization loop diagram, taking that beyond, it's a slide in my keynote, and actually build it into their compliance training. So for about 6 months, we co-designed a pilot program that rewrote escalation protocols, and we added some new decision checkpoints into their approval process and trained the managers to spot and intervene when pressure or rationalization started to build. So seeing my framework that was like a slide become an actual project inside a company of that scale was the moment, I knew this work actually had grown beyond just telling my story. It was actually shaping systems. So I think for the future, I'll look to do more of that work. Again, that goes well beyond my story. And I just keep investing into my own learning, talking to regulators. I know we talk all the time, academics and reading the research, listening to critics. And my hope is that one day, I would get hired not because of my past, but because of the quality and usefulness of the insight for today. And I think that's actually the measure of true redemption for me, moving from beyond this guy with the crazy story to actually being the guy with the value. And if I can keep doing that, then I think I'll still have something worth saying, years from now, long after the novelty of my case has faded.
What I found really fascinating is what you do on social media, because that points in this very much in this direction, and that your content is incredibly thoughtful now. And I'd encourage anybody to go and look at your LinkedIn post, but also subscribe to your Substack, where you're really starting to unpick some of these details. And I guess that's a little bit of an R&D lab stroke, sharing some of the things that you're discovering as you're going.
That's right. And I think, I wouldn't have been able to have these insights a year or two into doing it. Again, I was dealing with a lot of shame and just telling a crazy story. But now, again, if I want to do this for a long time, I have, I guess, the pattern recognition of seeing, so many situations where a few times a company will invite me to speak because they've had an employee with a past transgression that maybe they can't talk about because of employment law or something. But I can come in and kind of see how these patterns repeat. And so I've started writing a lot more this year on a Substack that's more personal reflections, and on a LinkedIn newsletter that's more specific to the buyers of my presentations, and just looking at what are people not talking about, or where are the gaps in this discussion, and just trying to provide as much value as possible and not repeat the typical talking points that are out there. So I'm just looking at it, not having so much of a planned strategy, just when something hits me or there's an insight in that conversation or a follow-up call after an engagement that, hey, this is worth sort of trying to figure out in my head 800-word Substack and think about what that means and how it can resonate. So again, looking for and pulling the threads for the lessons beyond just a captivating 1 hour story on the stage. So that's kind of my approach. And then doing more videos now too, talking about the classic slippery slope and how it starts and how it escalates. And we see that everywhere, and not just business and society. And so more content like that just makes people think and say, hey, I haven't really heard something phrased exactly like that. I'd like to learn more. And so that's my goal.
Give us a sense of that, because I love you have this lovely formulation, which is it doesn't start with X, it starts with. Just give us a sort of illustration of that, because I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. So the latest one I did was just stepping out of business, just because it just came to mind, was for a high school teacher that I'm friends with, and I spoke at her class a few years ago, and she said, today, I think it's tough to be a teacher now in high school because you have AI and cheating. And the way I thought about it for students is, it won't begin with a full essay written by AI. So it starts with, say, one homework problem, and a student maybe tired after practice and behind on assignments, paste a math question into a chatbot, and they copy the solution, and they'll tell themselves, it's just one problem, I get the material anyway. It feels like more like efficiency and not cheating, but then the next time it's easier. Maybe a history response is due and the student has the AI summarize the chapter, and they tweak a few words and then they hand it in, and the teacher probably doesn't notice. The grade is fine. And the student thinks, I could have done that. I just saved some time. And then what starts to happen here is the slope steepens. So short paragraphs become full essays. Citations are generated without being checked. And the AI isn't a tool to learn anymore. It's a replacement for the actual learning. But then that's when their rationalizations would grow louder. Everyone else is doing it. Grades matter more than the process. And over time, the habit takes hold, and what began as shortcuts on homework spreads to tests, college applications, even internships. And on paper, the grades look strong, but the skills fall further and further behind. And by the time the student, say, reaches a job or an advanced program, they won't have the foundation to perform. And the danger is it never felt like cheating in the moment. It felt like borrowing a little help, or saving a little time. But one shortcut turned into a pattern. And when it's exposed, it damages trust, of course, with teachers, peers, or even, their future employers. And the funny thing is it doesn't start with the intent to cheat. It started with one problem, copy pasted into a chatbot back in high school. And that's exactly how the slope works, or those tiny rationalizations that seem invisible until they're not.
What I love about this is it's one of the things that's compelling about your story, because you have these headline-grabbing, Instagrammable moments, if I lose that sort of terminology, and that's the great points. And again, people should listen to the story if they haven't heard it. But it's kind of like, that's not the first move. We're all shocked by the big headlines and the big scandalous things. But your point, that's not the entry level, and we don't see any of that, and we don't really talk about that. And so I think what you're doing is shining a light, and we kind of all know this in ourselves as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when people hear, former Wall Street hedge fund analyst or ex-FBI informant, they kind of default to the same arc, the rise, the fall, the confession. And from the outside, those of us who cross that line in the white collar settings can look kind of interchangeable. Another rogue trader now telling how he got caught and came back wiser, or that perception exists because many talks really are apology tours dressed up as keynotes. But the space isn't monolithic. Some speakers are doing PR or monetizing notoriety. Others, and I put myself here, take a painful, costly experience and turn it into lessons professionals can actually use. The difference is whether the story ends with, look at me, or begins with, here's what you can learn. So my aim isn't anymore a confessional roadshow or to brand myself as different. It's to go deeper than the biography, to show how the pressure, the culture, the mental gymnastics can push people over the line. And then also how organizations can build safeguards before it happens. And that's a very different conversation than I was bad, now I'm good. And the audiences are starting to recognize the difference.
I don't know if you've ever added it up, but one of the things I find remarkable about you is that you've been through an experience. Well, one, your past experience is something many of us haven't experienced, but also your present experience, talking about yourself and what you have done. I mean, you must have told this story thousands of times. And it seems to me that one of the benefits of your approach, apart from making it more relevant, keeping it fresh, is that I guess if you were just constantly telling the same story, you could easily get into autopilot. And so I'm really intrigued as to what does it feel like to have to tell your story? Do you have any sense of, one, how many times you've told it, but secondly, talk a little bit about what that feels like, and maybe how some of this new content, I guess, helps you to not turn up and just sort of phone it in?
Yeah. So I have an Excel spreadsheet that started 9 years ago, just of each engagement. I think it's over 630 talks the last 9 years. So that's a lot, going around pretty much every week talking about the worst thing you ever did. So, I would ask my wife, I wonder why I'm so busy. She's like, well, who wants to do that? So it was sort of like interesting, right? When you think about that as a speaker, you asked earlier, I didn't really have a great elevator pitch. I guess that is my elevator pitch. I go around, talk to audiences about the worst thing I ever did. But I think for me, again, getting my mental health right, it wasn't right when I started. It was still a lot of shame. I'm a terrible person that did a bad thing. So one day, an event planner pulled me aside, one of my first conferences, and said, the audience liked it, but they also felt you are not in a good headspace. And we always want the audience to feel like the speaker is okay mentally. So I had to work through that. But really, it's taking a moment, and I really appreciated, Christian, when your post about taking a moment before you speak to be by yourself. I do the same thing, just to get, for me, is to get myself back in that headspace. How do I bring the story? Again, there's crazy parts of the story, but also how do I bring the insight? So again, and I think when I started, I was more of like looking at myself as the hero, and now I'm there, like, how do I tell these stories, but also get it to where the audience feels them and is taking the insights and is going to go back again Monday morning and start applying this, not just talk about me at the water cooler Monday. Oh, did you hear that guy's crazy story, and shake their heads and go back to their desk. So that's how I've looked at this, and then working in, some of the latest insights. And so when somebody has me back a year later, my biggest, I think, source of pride is not so much a standing ovation. I think I've gotten one ever, and that's not what I'm ever going for. It's like, one gentleman in Hong Kong saw me there last year. He said, I made 4 trips to Hong Kong. And he said, I see you every time you're here, and it's always a little bit different. So for me, that was a real source of pride, because the story doesn't change, but he just noticed that the insights were a little bit different every time.
And there's something really interesting about what you just said, which I hadn't thought about before. But I guess the risk of just the sort of glamorized, almost like the TV show drama or whatever, where if that was it, and the water cooler moment is, as you hear that guy with his crazy stories, right? It becomes something that would never happen to us, right? He's got these wild stories, and the only thing I've got to take away from that is the wild stories. And by implication, that the adjective wild means that's, I would never find myself in that position. So you would have almost completely failed. And so there's a really interesting thing there that says, I guess the story can only really serve a purpose if that latter part is there, because otherwise it just becomes a sort of piece of gossip. Oh, I met this guy who had this. Nothing happens from it. And in fact, possibly worse outcomes come, because people sort of put you in the box of, well, I'm not like him. And what you're trying to do is bridge that gap between the story's engaging and grabs attention, but it also then has to be relatable on some level. And of course, by default, for most of us, it isn't directly relatable because we've never done.
That's right. And the wild story speaker who's only the wild story, there's definitely a market for that. And it's almost to my commercial detriment, because they actually can, have a higher speaking fee and all that, because they're just entertaining the audience, and they're like, dramatic pauses and doing all that. So there are people that come back, from past transgressions, and that's all they're going to do. And there's a bigger commercial opportunity than my sort of compliance and ethics world. But that's fine, and that's not me, because that's not being authentic to myself. I want, at some point after the talk, people write things down. The most common thing I hear is somebody will watch the whole talk and just come back to one of my first points about isolate decision making. They're going to go back. They're going to look at all their groups, all their teams, and figure out where this could be happening, where people are making decisions in isolation, and try to put in protocols or controls to mitigate that. So that's my sign of success, not somebody, just getting into the glamorized stories and that's all they remember. So I appreciate that. Although I also would say, if I just leaned into glamorized stories and just making like a mockery of it, there's a market for that, that actually there's speakers that do that, but that's not me authentically how I want to do this.
I mean, it really strikes me that the market for that is a bit like fast food, right? It sort of there's an immediate satisfaction from hearing that stuff, but it doesn't have any long-term benefits. In fact, arguably has long-term disbenefits because you're not really connecting it to your world. I think yours it's more nutritious, I'll put it that way.
That's right. That's right. It's just about giving people insights that they can use from the story. The story gets me in the room, obviously. I don't want to say it's not because of the story, but then the balance of people engaging with it, laughing at the some of the crazy moments, gasping, even getting emotional at some of those moments, but in the end, just having those takeaways that they can take back. So it's a balance of being a storyteller, but also somewhat of a subject matter expert now 9 years into doing this. And again, as I said earlier, just understanding where the gaps are, where my experience can be helpful, and still mining that, and not too much leaning back on just mining my old past transgressions, because then again, I think you're at risk of phoning it in when you're doing that, and just balancing it with what's happening in the world today.
And you mentioned your mental health. I think that's a really interesting point, because the life of a speaker, you could see it as quite glamorous, right? Going around lots of places, in stage, you have the audience's attention, almost like a kind of rock star tour. And there are, of course, people that play into that thing. But I wondered actually, how do you preserve your mental health? Because it seems to me that if you are putting everything into these sessions, and you are putting everything in the sense of you're bearing your soul to people, and sure, okay, you've done it enough times to be used to doing it, but you're also trying to reflect on things, because you're not phoning it in. This isn't lazy stuff. This must be quite tiring and take a lot from you. And I know that when you're traveling, you do a number of them, but I also know that you have techniques for kind of making sure this is not an efficiency play where you fill every moment of your day. You need those spaces. And I wondered how you think about preserving your mental health with these things. Is it restricting the number that you do? Is it having activities? How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's definitely, I think there's some restriction. As I said, now I'm a little bit more asking more diligence questions on my end with the event planner. What's the goal? Is it just a crazy true crime story? Then that's not for me. So I do have, I guess, the opportunity now, several years into doing this, to be able to turn down opportunities that don't feel right. And then the opportunities that want me to lean back into just the craziness of the story is like, I can walk away from that now. So I want to get onto stages where it's the story plus the impact of the insights. Beforehand, I do a few breathing exercises before I get on stage, just to get myself back into that mental state of what was happening with me at the FBI. But then I can also tell myself, hey, you're taking the audience back there, but you're actually not there today. And so mitigating some of that shame I might feel about the experience. And also after the event, it's important again to go back to I just do breathing exercises to get myself back into a more normalized state, because it is an emotional talk. If it becomes too polished, if that speaking coach that saw me last year said it's a great polished speech, and you have all the perfect, pause points, and you have all the standing ovations, that's not what I wanted. It's too polished. And so if it ever got to that, I think I would stop doing it. So it's a matter of going on the stage and coming back off and coming back to 2025 where I am today, and being able to engage with people. So it's not an easy thing to do. And I do wonder, I'm 9 years into doing it. And it's okay. Would I wake up 15 years into doing it and say, you know what, this is not serving its purpose anymore, or maybe it's still having an impact, but it's not doing good by me. And so I think that's still up in the air. But right now, just that feedback, the audience's questions, me being able to take those questions and reformulate my content, that keeps me going. And the engagement from these events sort of keep me going right now.
And I detect from you, just the conversations we've had, there's a real sense of curiosity, right? And I think it seems to me, and I'd be really interested in your views on it, it seems to me that because you've taken the time to think about what you've done and why you did it, and you're looking to understand the psychology behind it and looking for parallels and sort of almost making sense of this, that seems to me to be quite an important part of what you do. And so there's an intellectual curiosity that underpins what you're doing. You really want to understand this. What the hell happened, and why do we do this stuff?
Yeah, that's right. And I think you have to have that curiosity, or at least from my experience, you have to have it. So I think if I didn't even have this past of Tipper X, I'd still be interested into why regular people make the wrong decisions. This whole field of behavioral science and it's just fascinating to me. Always read the latest books that are out in the space, the latest articles, what people post, because if I can find any insights to sort of keep my story fresh, that keeps me going. But it sort of fills my intellectual kind of curiosity, as you mentioned. So I think I'm lucky that, well, I'm either unlucky that I have the story, but also lucky now because I actually find it really interesting. Why do we make these choices? And so I think that stands out in my talks and the way I do this. Like, you could be a speaker, thrown it in for a few years, but I think you'd probably get tired of that if you're actually not really interested into impacting behavior change. If you're just there for a paycheck, I don't think it's sort of lasting, longer term.
And how do you measure success? Clearly, money is like that's a function of how many you're doing, and you've talked about those kind of conversations. But I guess a lot of this is intangible. The real satisfaction levels. I wondered how you thought about that.
Yeah, I think the way I think about it, right? It's definitely not monetary because I do turn down opportunities, so it's not about maximizing revenue any one year. It's just about impact, making people think. Now, I think about with my family, I have two teenage daughters, just sort of making them, or just showing that, hey, they know my story now very well. They saw me speak at an event earlier this year where my whole family was invited, and seeing the impact it had on them. And, my oldest daughter came up and said, oh, wow, one decision can really impact your life. And that kind of keeps me going, that they see what I do, that it makes an impact, that I just feel like this is the path I should be on. As I said, when we started, I could have probably hired a reputation management firm that are out there and tried to clean this stuff up off of Google, but leaning into it can't ever, can never escape it, but trying to use it for positive. I guess I don't really have a great measure of success, but I just feel like this is the right path for me and what I should be doing now.
And I'm not sure there should be one, right? Because it is unquantified. The moment you start quantifying it, interestingly, I think this plays into the entire subject, right? We know that in other contexts where we quantify things, the quantification is often wrong. If we look at, banking would be a good example, right? We know what the downsides of those things if you skew towards the wrong metric, and even the perfect metric is going to have some downsides. And that's why I kind of wanted to pick behind the what I call the business model, because I think it's kind of what makes you tick. Why are you doing this? And there's a sort of lazy answer to why are you doing this, but then there's a more sophisticated one, which is I don't want to say this is what you've been put on the planet to do, but this is, given what's happened, feels like the right place for you to be. And so I guess the metric is a sense of purpose and determination to make a difference.
Yeah, and it's funny for me to say because I went to a great business school and I have no business plan. So, it's because I've talked to consultants about how could I grow the business, and they'll say, well, you should be starting a business. You're just running around with your story. It's very boom and bust with the economy. You should actually have a business you can exit. Hire these people, bring them on, build it to a $10 million revenue business, and then exit at this multiple. And then that's not like, that's what I guess I should be thinking from somebody that went to the Wharton School of Business, but that's not how I think today. I guess in my 40s, if I had this business in my 20s, maybe that would have been more important for me doing it that way. But in my 40s, I guess just with the life experience, that's not my, not having a business plan is kind of the way I want to go. And so, as I mentioned, a year and a half ago, this advisory engagement came to me, and I wasn't looking to do advisory work. But now that I've done that, I'm talking to other companies about potentially doing that, so I can kind of see how that business model might evolve. But again, it's not really intentional. It's just being out there, being vulnerable, trying to make people think, and then whatever comes to me will come. And that's the way that I feel like is the truest, most truest thing for myself that I can be doing right now, and have a sense of purpose.
But I love those suggestions because it's business logical, but by default, you're not scalable, right? And so if someone were to hire you sorry, Tom couldn't make it today, but here's someone else telling his story, right? The people be irritated, quite understandably, right? Because they want you and they want what you bring and your unique approach. And so by default, it's a kind of, it isn't a scalable proposition as it currently stands, and nor can it be. And so I love the fact that you've just eschewed all that logic to go, I'm going to do something that's intrinsically motivated, right? There isn't the absence of a business plan seems to me to be the whole point, which is you're finding this out for yourself and working out what works for you. And there isn't a playbook. I mean, there are lots of people you could copy, But I think that wouldn't work for you, because this has to be something that's authentic to you, for you to be able to continue to do it and for you to continue to have success at doing it. It needs to work for you. And so the idea of a sort of formulaic plan, I think this is a really, really good example of a business built on a very human basis to what you do.
Yeah, and I think if I were to have a business plan, back when I was in the investing world, we did discounted cash flows, so I could model out my cash flows now. But you also have to have a terminal value. And I think about this, it's just me. I don't have a terminal value to exit off of. So it's not that analysis that I'm even going to bother doing. It's just about, again, showing up. The opportunities are there. I kind of know how the year is going to shake out. About half my talks every year happen in the last 4 months of the year, when people are going to get back from the summer and figure out if they have budget to do it. And if it doesn't happen this year, it usually happens in a future year or so. Keeping it just that way, and just keeping it very authentic to myself, is the most important thing to me now. If I start doing things because there's a big commercial opportunity to do it a certain way, then I think hopefully I'll have the alarm bells in my head going off, saying that, I'm rationalizing this decision because there's a commercial opportunity to be not authentic. Hopefully I'll have the guardrails to say that's not the right thing for me.
And I was just thinking about who you would get to advise you, because unless somebody's been through something similar to what you've been through, it's really hard to kind of put oneself in that position. That's why you go out and speak, right? Because it's not easy for us to imagine about how these things happen. So there isn't a natural playbook, and I guess you're doing it your way, and that points to not copying the kind of turn up, tell the horror story and walk out thing. You're finding a way to make it work for you. But there isn't anyone that can advise you on that. It's a really rare business, I guess, to use that term, that is, you have to just rely on yourself. And I guess that's where your wife becomes a really critical part of this, in terms of being a check and balance for you and making sure that you're delivering that. If there was a playbook, it probably wouldn't. I can't imagine anybody who have written one, but the playbook probably doesn't exist. You have to go out and do this uniquely your way.
Yeah, and I think that's of any one person business. There's some truth to that, even though somebody without my past. But I think with the past and what I'm doing, there's not really, to your point, anything out there that I can look at and replicate. And I found it important to have an unofficial personal board of advisors. So obviously my wife is on there. You're actually on there. You might not know it, but which we talk about, what we're seeing all the time. And so just having a few voices like that to check in with, to see what's out there, what's not being talked about enough. How could I go back and kind of develop some insights that would be helpful? That's all I'm trying to do, just to be of service, be helpful as much as possible. And then, good things will come from that.
Tom, as always happens with you, I learn a ton of things. Time just flies. Thank you. Thank you for being you in terms of talking about your business and going behind the scenes, because I know you talk about your past experiences quite a lot, but some of this stuff was absolutely fascinating. And I think really, really important for people to understand. Hopefully that's given them a sense of what goes into what you do, where this might go, and also helping people to think about, if they, maybe they've seen you and they want to hire someone else, to think about some of those criteria, because as you point out, not all the people doing the sorts of things that you're doing are doing the same thing. I would say what you're doing is incredibly unique for the reasons that we've outlined. So thank you for all those things. But above all, thank you, one, for what you do, because I think it's really powerful. But secondly, once again, for coming onto the show and providing some amazing insights. Before I let you go, remind people how they can find you.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me back again, Christian. It's tipperx.com, TIPPERX.com. I've just heard back from the U.S. Patent Office that my trademark on TipperX has been approved. So in the next FBI investigation, they'll have to have a Tipper W and a Tipper Y. So that's out there for now. So tipperx.com is where I am. All my information's there.
Amazing. We'll put a link just in case people can't remember that. It is highly memorable, but just in case they get confused about which letter it is, then we link to that in the show. It's also linked to your Substack and your LinkedIn. But once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Tom for appearing. To find out more about Tom, to hear the episode in which he explains his story, to discover more about his work, subscribe to his Substack, find him on LinkedIn, or to pre-order his amazing book, and I have had a sneak peek of it, Wired on Wall Street, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show, please do leave a review. It really helps other people to discover it. For you to discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the website humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and perhaps take a moment to reflect on small decisions you're making today that might have bigger consequences tomorrow. But above all, thank you so much for listening.